What I'd like to offer today is a reflection on the debate you've been exposed to in this class dealing with the implications of Atlantic piracy for how we view the Royal Navy, naval power, and state power in the 18th century. The course asks you to contemplate both the bureaucratic reach and governmental legitimacy of the British state, especially at sea and in coastal communities. Both camps you've been exposed to think that piracy and the state-sponsored campaign to delegitimize it shed light on the nature of the British state and on the mercantile and legal beliefs of British subjects. When commenting on Atlantic piracy, historians habitually use the 1720s as a line of demarcation signaling an endpoint, a transition from the golden age of piracy to a golden age of privateering. To these historians, people like Rediker and Ritchie and Starkey, this shift reflected the growth of British naval command in the Atlantic world as British officials on land and sea used the Royal Navy, the Customs Service, and the courts to confront, chase, capture, and execute pirates. In the first decade of the 18th century, according to this view, naval policing was expanded to the Atlantic and the Caribbean with demonstrable success in suppressing piracy and turning public opinion against pirates and their commercial and political backers. The Royal Navy functioned as an effective police force, which in the course of a single generation, from the late 1690s to the 1720s, transformed the Atlantic from a wild, violent frontier into an orderly setting for maritime commerce. So this is the current understanding, or the reigning understanding of the chronology of piracy's demise. And the timing of this development indicates how and why it took place, rapidly through confrontation at sea and port. So the significance of this field of study has to do with the power and legitimacy of the British state. According to this reigning view, Britain policed and pacified the ocean by force. It brought local courts and local office holders into compliance with Parliament. And it changed the commercial and ethical habits of consumers, converting them from enablers and supporters of piracy to enemies of piracy, converting them from communities that ignored imperial law to communities that internalized and adhered to it. When I started my research on this, my aim was to follow this narrative and analyze the mechanics of this civilizing conquest of the ocean and coastal towns. But I didn't find strong evidence to support this thesis. What I found instead is that, first, piracy was not suppressed. And when it did disappear in the 1830s and 40s, it was not due to naval policing. Economic forces made it less profitable, especially following the outbreak of a stable peace in 1815. Second, the practice of marine insurance actually bolstered piracy by insulating merchants from piracy-related losses. And third, the public remained happily complicit in piratical activity in the 18th century, just as it had been in the 17th. Despite increasingly harsh anti-piracy legislation, the Atlantic in the 18th century and the early 19th century remained a wild frontier in which armed commerce was the norm, not the exception. And this last issue, the distance between law and practice, is what I'd like to discuss today. So first, I will briefly outline the growing distance between statutory law and commercial practice at sea and port. Second, I'll point out that this distance between imperial law and commercial practice corresponded with the distance between the seat of government and the myriad locations of commercial activity. Government's efforts to bridge this ethical gap between law and practice therefore involved attempts to bridge the geographic gap as well by thickening central governance and diluting local governance in distant jurisdictions and at sea. Last, I will suggest that we should understand statutory law on piracy as a form of propaganda regarding the reach of state authority. So we should see it as a proclamation of the British government's policy aspirations, a proclamation of its presumptions to jurisdiction and influence in peripheral communities. Such propaganda remained unconvincing under a government that demonstrated to constituents daily that it did not have the ability to enforce the law. So the gap I refer to between law and practice is easily visible. Statutory law and royal proclamations and regulations from the 17th and 18th centuries delineated clearly the criminality of commercial practices like piracy, freebooting, wrecking, smuggling, and trading with the enemy in wartime. Yet imperial officials routinely complained about recalcitrant local communities, both in Britain and the New World, whose actions they believed bordered on rebellion or treason. Merchants trading with the enemy in times of war. Manufacturers selling military supplies on the private market rather than to the government, or to the purchasing agents of the government. Massive smuggling and contraband trade. Merchants and local authorities supporting and giving cover to known pirates and smugglers. Wrecking that went unabated despite governmental condemnations and efforts at suppression. And local mobs happily liberating indicted and convicted pirates and smugglers and their cargoes from custody, if local juries and grand juries didn't acquit them beforehand. This is consistent with the documented aid provided to illegal traders by colonial governors and other local officials who offered them capital, intelligence, legal aid, as well as privateering commissions or pardons. Okay? My point is that these provincial officials were not corrupted into tolerating and participating in piracy. Local authorities simply shared the attitudes of their constituents and their neighbors on these issues. Freebooters and smugglers were not part of a fringe or underground criminal subculture. They conducted their trade in the open and enjoyed material, civic, and political rewards for their service to their local economies, communities, and governments. So, for example, when New York's Governor Bellamont hounded pirates and their backers, he triggered angry responses and intense political pressure from colonial subjects and their commercial associates in London. Local authorities obstructed his endeavors and tried to have him fired, claiming that the governor was secretly working in the service of the Dutch to drive trade away from New York. This strident opposition no doubt influenced Bellamont's successors to discontinue his policies. Okay? Constituents of local communities in New York and elsewhere across the Atlantic continued to see illegal traders as conventional and respectable merchants. And they resented and resisted efforts by imperial agents to hound and prosecute merchants and sea captains and crews for engaging in commerce. With regard to piracy, there was a lack of clarity even among 18th and 19th century jurists, let alone the general public, as to whether governments and courts had jurisdiction at sea. The U.S. Supreme Court, under the leadership of John Marshall, who was not shy about claiming far-ranging jurisdictions for the federal government, that court denied American claims to jurisdiction at sea. The Marshall Court held that activities outlawed by statute were in fact protected, or at least beyond the range of prosecution, on the high seas. Now, the mechanism by which king and parliament aimed to communicate to constituents the criminality of these trades was harsh and effective enforcement. Okay? But the central government's enforcement efforts proved unequal to the task. Despite ratcheting up the law enforcement and public relations campaign against pirates, wreckers, smugglers, and their accomplices, and despite the increasing severity of penalties imposed on those convicted, the government did not curtail the volume of smuggling and freebooting. In fact, the scope of illegal trade actually increased. The campaign to suppress and delegitimize these trades, though not successful, offered agents of state authority an opportunity to articulate, through legislation, an ideology of law and of state. Okay. This vision and the policies it informed were actively and successfully resisted by British subjects, both high and low, who clung to a more archaic view of society, state, and law. This resistance was prompted and fueled by economic self-interest, a quest for profits, but also by the backward-looking, traditional, localist worldview of wide swaths of British society on both sides of the ocean. This is evidenced by the fact that this resistance was not merely impulsive or lawless. It was articulated in legalistic and constitutional terms. Local communities not only differed with Parliament and the courts and the court about the criminality of a host of commercial activities, like again piracy, wrecking, etc., but also denied the national government's claim to jurisdiction at sea and within these localities. This divergence between local communities and custom, on the one hand, and the national government and statutory law, on the other, was particularly evident with regard to the sister industries of piracy and smuggling. So the massive scope of illegal trade reveals an early modern commercial mentality, a conviction that commerce with rivals, enemies, pirates, wreckers, and smugglers was conventional and legitimate. Okay? But it also reveals an early modern political mentality. The investors and sailors involved in these trades saw themselves as law-abiding and patriotic subjects or citizens. Okay? Rather than elevating private interests above the public good, they were regarded as providing local communities with cheap goods and lucrative markets, as Bellomont's harsh experience in New York exemplifies. Trade with the enemy, freebooting, and smuggling were not products of a deficit of loyalty or loyalism and patriotism. They were merely products of a conventionally localist view of the economy and of the state. So despite the stream of statutes and regulations that became increasingly assertive and punitive, and despite the creation of the Preventive Service and the Coast Guard, and despite deputizing the Royal Navy and privateers to assist in this fight, law enforcement efforts remained inadequate to the task. Illegal trade and the black market it supported remained a key component of the British economy throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries, providing cheap goods for consumers and good jobs for many inhabitants in coastal communities. Not just sailors, but also dock workers, transporters, hawkers, retailers, and others. Okay. Central governments remained powerless to change, through legislation, the local practices of maritime trade as late as the mid-19th century. Okay. 19th century administrators charged with the task of enforcing metropolitan policies echoed the frustrated complaints of their 17th and 18th century predecessors, castigating locals for conspiring en masse with criminals against the authorities. When examining the vast gap between law and commercial practice at sea, one must keep in mind that even on land, the central government faced serious difficulties in imposing its will and authority, enforcing the law, providing security on roads and city streets, collecting taxes, and above all, convincing its subjects of the legitimacy of such efforts at centralized governance. This was doubly true at sea and at the water's edge, where the government's reach exceeded its grasp and where its jurisdiction was highly contested and mostly ignored. Coastal villages and port towns were the point of contact between maritime commerce and the more ordered commerce of landed communities. And they exhibited the friction between the unregulated, violent nature of seaborne trade and the law enforcement and taxation initiatives of landed governments. Okay. The increasingly severe rhetorical, legislative, and judicial measures against illegal trade were not effective in deterring smugglers, freebooters, and their confederates from these trades, but these endeavors reflected the growing frustration of government agencies with the open lawlessness in the country. And they also, of course, reflected the increasingly desperate financial needs of the Treasury. If the government's law and order campaign was an effort to punish wrongdoers and communicate to the public new standards of criminality, the limited dispersal of law enforcement agents in distant ports undermined both undertakings. Woefully outnumbered by active smuggling crews, pirates, and wreckers, customs agents in Britain, and even more so in the colonies, were too few and too marginalized to do their job effectively. Now, the post of customs officer was a thankless job involving an unattractive combination of low wages, social isolation, and high risk of violence and prosecution. While customs authorities and courts did have intermittent success in capturing contraband cargoes and convicting smugglers, they were surrounded by a sea of contraband and systemic customs evasion. Local communities in English and American port towns discouraged customs agents and other imperial office holders from enforcing imperial law in a variety of ways: friendship, peer pressure, community values, bribery, other financial incentives, threats of violence, actual violence, threats of prosecution, and actual prosecutions. In England, this was especially true in ports farther away from London, in the north and the west of England. Okay. Scottish and Irish ports, even more than English ones, were known for hostility towards the customs service. Ireland, in particular, operated as a de facto free trade zone. Indeed, the stark violence towards customs agents that was evident in England was not as prevalent in Ireland and North America, since enforcement efforts there were much weaker than along England's southern coast. And when enforcement efforts picked up in America in the 1760s, towards the Revolution, so did violence towards imperial customs officers in America. To a considerable degree, the rapid development during the 18th century of major port cities in North America and Western Britain, such as Philadelphia, Baltimore, Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow, this urban growth was a product of the thriving smuggling industry in these ports and the security and hospitality that these distant communities offered freebooters and their partners. Because distance strained available manpower and hampered the effort to curb and delegitimize illegal trade and to collect the customs, various measures were taken to enhance the presence of governmental enforcers at sea and in distant ports. For example, responding to local juries and magistrates habitually sheltering freebooters from arrest and prosecution, Parliament transferred piracy cases in 1700 from civilian courts to admiralty courts, those military tribunals you've read about. As import taxes continued to rise in the 18th century and the ranks of illegal traders swelled, Britain established coastal patrols by the Preventive Service expanded the size and mandate of the customs service, and also offered naval officers bounties to apprehend smugglers. And the king attracted even more agents to this task by issuing privateering commissions against smugglers. So the solution to the problem of distance was transporting or attracting more manpower to police the various localities of imperial trade. To the same end, imperial administrators also attempted to change bureaucratic structures to reduce what they considered the corrupting influence of local communities and institutions on enforcement agents of the royal government: customs agents, naval officers, prosecutors, judges, governors, etc. These efforts did produce more tax revenues, but the black market in pirated and smuggled goods continued to expand. Moreover, the public proved highly resistant to the government's effort to delegitimize freebooters, wreckers, smugglers, and contraband traders. These traders were regarded as both conventional and economically helpful to local economies, and also to the imperial economy. By contrast, the notion that landed governments had the jurisdiction and authority to disallow certain commercial practices at sea, that was regarded as unconventional and novel, as well as economically injurious. Even though the campaign against illegal trade failed to convince locals to shun pirates and smuggled goods, it reveals a recognition on the part of imperial officials that a campaign against illegal trade required a public relations campaign against the commercial, legal, and moral beliefs of consumers and merchants and office holders. Simply outlawing certain practice by statute was not achieving the desired result. The fact that anti-piracy and anti-smuggling laws were reissued regularly and with escalating rhetorical ferocity indicates governmental frustration over continued practices. These numerous laws and regulations should not be construed as reflecting new commercial practices at sea. Okay. This observation is a methodological critique offered by legal and cultural historians when addressing piracy specialists like Rediker. Okay. These legal and cultural scholars point out that modern observers, including historians, have a natural tendency to project onto the 18th century the jurisprudence, sensibilities, and logic of the modern nation state. Basically, modern accounts of modern histories of piracy tend to read early modern statutes, royal proclamations, and parliamentary rhetoric as credible indications of reality on board ships, in port towns, and in local government bureaucracies. If a similar approach were adopted to study our own society, one might conclude that the government has curbed a host of social ills that in actuality it has been impotent to delegitimize, let alone control. Take drug use, underage drinking, for example. Okay? So anti-piracy and anti-smuggling statutes and in official records can give us a false impression of actual commercial practices and conventions. As important, they don't reveal that they represent only one side of an ideological contest, nor do they reveal the degree to which the central government's understanding of the state was challenged or merely ignored locally. So what I suggest is that we should see here two opposing legal belief systems. Okay? English custom accommodated the practice of tax evasion and violent seizure at sea, while English law, or statutory law that is, increasingly sought to regulate and eventually abolish these. When scholars discuss freebooting and smuggling using the language of crime, they validate 18th century state rhetoric and ideology, even though all contemporary accounts official and unofficial, report that British communities did not consider these trades to be criminal, illegitimate, or disreputable. If you examine our own register of statutes and regulations, state or federal, you'll find many laws and regulations that list as crimes activities that people do daily. Okay? For example, in some jurisdictions, throwing snowballs at people is considered assault. Okay? The people who live there know that snowball fights are technically illegal on paper, or that kids are not allowed to have lemonade stands without a commercial permit from the city. But we live in this society, so through daily life, we get the message that throwing a snowball and selling lemonade are not really crimes. Okay? After all, nobody you know observes these laws, and lawbreakers are not thought of as criminals by their neighbors, by the cops, or by the government. So if I wrote a book about crime in America, I would be misleading my readers if I did not include this cultural context of daily life when I discuss many laws that are on the books. By telling my readers that the ancient legal practice of kids selling lemonade on the street is a crime, I'm asking them to accept as established law what we know is a legal novelty that is hotly contested. So if I wrote that book, I'd be laughed at or dismissed by readers. But readers 300 years from now might very well believe me. In their world, maybe kids really don't have lemonade stands and snowball fights because neighbors complain about it and the cops arrest them for it. Okay? So my future readers might actually believe that these laws that we have on the books today are legit. If I exposed these readers from the future only to the statutory law, they would have a skewed and incorrect view of how life was lived locally in the early 21st century. And privateering is a good example of how misleading statutory law can be in this respect. New governmental regulations in the early 18th century indicate, to some scholars, that privateering had become a well-regulated business from the initial license to the final decree in prize court. And indeed, privateering commissions articulated the precise boundaries of legitimate commerce rating, outlining national government's view of the legal and ethical line separating pirate from privateer. These privateering commissions, offer lengthy and detailed legal procedures of capturing prizes, bringing them to port, and claiming title to them in court. Other acts and regulations provided exhaustive elucidations on the terms and restrictions binding privateers, supplemented by copious explanations of prize procedures, outlining procedures for processing prize claims, addressing the protests of aggrieved shipmasters or proprietors, assessing competing claims, and so forth. Okay. Privateer owners borrowed this legal boilerplate in their instructions to ship captains. Okay. An admiralty court applied such laws, regulations, and proclamations to actual cases brought before them. So these early modern sources point to the existence of a robust body of legal and bureaucratic provisions that purported to regulate privateering. Okay. Now, while historians of piracy acknowledge, in passing, that such regulations were not effective at actually regulating the trade, they nevertheless present a dividing line between pirate and privateer as a real thing. In treating statutes and royal proclamations and parliamentary rhetoric as reliable reflections of actual practices at sea, they give credence to parliamentary and court presumptions of authority, jurisdiction, and effectiveness on the peripheries of the British state. Even though all modern scholars and early modern observers acknowledge that it was impossible to keep privateers within the bounds of legal conduct and to prevent them from broadening their operations into open piracy. Okay. Contemporaries in the 17th and 18th centuries, as products of a pre-modern state, intuitively accepted as a practical and ethical reality the murkiness and irrelevance of these legal categories, pirate and privateer, which were handed down to them by Parliament. Okay. So whereas state authorization for commerce rating matters a great deal to modern scholars, it was a relatively hollow concept in a society that did not recognize that the state had the jurisdiction, the legal authority, and the moral legitimacy to allow or disallow armed commerce. In the book, I quote a 1795 scholarly study by Georg Friedrich de Martens on the laws governing privateering. And de Martens points out that laws regulating privateering were ill-observed and that privateers exceeded their legal bounds as a matter of course. Okay? And he reminds his law students that the laws give an idea of order and justice at sea in the same manner as portraits give an idea of persons who are not really there. Okay? And this observation is a salient reminder to modern readers that even in the late 18th century, prize law was a facade, creating in our minds an image of order which contemporary merchants, sailors, consumers, and officials did not see. So while the line dividing pirate from privateer was legally valid according to statutory law, it was culturally untrue, and according to common law, also legally dubious. Okay? What I suggest is that we should regard statutory law on these matters not as law, like the law that dictates that we drive on the right side of the road, but as a form of propaganda of state building. It failed in the 18th century to wash away constituents' attachment to local custom, common law, and local governance. But it was successful eventually in the 19th and especially the 20th centuries. And for us historians, the statutory law creates an illusion of order that is real and sensible to us, but was not real and not sensible to contemporaries. Legal historians of crime tell us that the strict and clear language of the criminal law cannot be taken as evidence of its application in practice. Nor should it suggest to us popular acquiescence to the law or public acceptance of the central government's presumption to dictate standards of criminality. These scholars point out that the law, as enacted by Parliament and understood by the court, differed from the legal beliefs as well as the informed legal opinion of wide segments of British society. Statutory law was a tool for implementing and explaining the doctrine of centralized governance that was forming in governmental circles in London in the mid-18th century. Okay. These are the doctrines of parliamentary supremacy and imperial parliamentary jurisdiction that you've read about. This is why the court went to the trouble of publishing and disseminating the proceedings of piracy trials. These publications were to educate the public about what is legal and illegal according to Parliament and the King. But by the same token, the ease and security with which merchants, sailors, and their collaborators got around the statutory law educated the public in the real world that the statutory law was superseded by an older, more traditional understanding of law, of state, and of the boundary between central and local authority. For example, the English state had claimed sovereignty in the British seas since the late 14th century. So successive generations of Englishmen were born, lived, and died with the recognition that although the court claimed to have authority to outlaw various practices and trades at sea, the sea was in fact free from governmental control and jurisdiction. Laws that condemned freebooting and upheld state jurisdiction at sea were very old, as was the widespread practical experience of the state's de facto impotence at sea. Commerce as practiced sent British constituents a stronger, a signal that was stronger than any statute of the civil law as to what business practices were legal, customary, and acceptable. And in a political culture that did not codify state authority and jurisdiction, common practice and common law were the primary guides as to what was legal and constitutional. The accepted storyline on the rise, decline, and fall of Atlantic piracy is a tale of civilization taming a wild frontier. National governments used this narrative to explain and defend their efforts to extend their reach and enforce their authority on their frontiers, on both land and sea. In these efforts, national governments articulated and upheld the differences between legitimate and illegitimate authority and force. For example, in the mid and late 19th century, the great powers discontinued privateering, drawing a sharp moral distinction between the force employed by government vessels and the violence applied by private vessels and the rogue regimes that commissioned them. We're all a product of this narrative because we were all born after this project has already been completed. Okay? Our national governments have established their reach and authority and enforcement throughout their territories, all the way from the national capital to the border. To a lesser degree, national governments have even extended their reach into the sea. Okay? It's not coincidental, then, that our own modern image of the sea as a territory governed by laws was shaped in an age of the internal combustion engine, when steam and diesel technology really did make navies more effective at blockading coastlines and patrolling the sea against interlopers and illegal traders. So naturally, given the state's greater capabilities and competence at sea, the idea of state jurisdiction at sea went from being a completely theoretical and legally dubious concept to a confused but established and accepted legal doctrine. Okay? So fundamentally, the legitimacy that the state and statutory law enjoy in the hearts and minds of modern constituents is born by first-hand experience that the state actually does have the practical ability to monopolize violence, to disarm non-state actors, to make certain activities illegal and illegitimate, and to enforce unpopular statutes from border to border, and even at sea. Governments did not enjoy this kind of credibility and legitimacy in the 18th century because they repeatedly demonstrated to constituents, through their failure to curb piracy and illegal trade, for example, that they did not have the capacity to exert real power locally. So the law, the statutory law as a form of propaganda, remained unconvincing then. Okay? The state's monopoly on violence at sea was articulated in statutory law at the time, just as it is today. But it was not accepted as legitimate, nor as a practical reality in peripheral communities. That gap between the written law and the habits and practices and values of the population is something that we moderns can easily miss. Yeah. I once read an observation about Lord Acton's famous aphorism that power corrupts. And certainly Acton was saying that wielding power over others encourages moral weakness in a ruler. But his central point was that power tends to corrupt the observer of the powerful, most specifically the historian. And it strikes me as a useful reminder on this issue of state authority and legitimacy. Because we moderns, historians included, we've been living within the modern nation state for roughly 150 years now. We're born into it, we live in it, we educate our children and students in it, and then our children and students do the same, and so on. Okay? And we observe tremendous administrative power wielded by our government bureaucracies in virtually every facet of our lives, and literally every single day of our lives. So it's natural for us to see the symbols and language and assumptions of state power as credible. So when we see state power and authority articulated in 18th century anti-piracy statutes, our own experience of observing state power in our daily lives makes us credulous. And it obscures from us the credibility gap that contemporaries experienced between law and custom then. Thank you for participating in this class. I enjoyed reading your work and your emails. I hope you enjoyed the class as well. And good luck on the exam, and enjoy the break.